DDR1 came out in 2000, and it was created because computers became heavier to run. So before DDR RAM existed, computers still used something called SDRAM. This SDRAM was too slow since it could only send one data at a time, which makes computers stutter and have longer loading times when we're trying to open something. That is why DDR RAM was created, which allows sending twice as much data compared to the previous SDRAM. So as a result, computers became more responsive. In terms of speed, it runs up to 400 MHz with a capacity up to 1 GB, which was enough for browsing the internet, doing office work, and playing light games such as Doom. However, DDR1 also came with a problem. It's using 2.5 volts of electricity, which is a lot for RAM. And since it consumes a lot of electricity, it produces more heat as well. So when RAM becomes too hot, your computer might crash or freeze. And what makes it worse is that DDR1 existed in the era of Windows Millennium Edition, which is the worst and the most unstable Windows version ever. So, not only did computers keep crashing because of the overheating RAM, programs in the Windows Millennium Edition often experienced errors as well. DDR2 came out in 2004 as an upgrade from DDR1. It ran at higher speeds around 400 MHz with the basic variant to 800 MHz with the higher-end version and supported 2 GB to 4 GB of memory per RAM stick. With this amount of RAM, computers can now open more programs at the same time. But it wasn't only the speed that changed. Every RAM generation also comes with a different notch position, and in the case of DDR2, the notch was moved to the middle to clearly differentiate it from DDR1. More importantly, DDR2 also used a lower voltage of just 1.8 volts. This means it consumed less power and produced less heat compared to DDR1. But even though DDR2 was faster, it was very expensive back then. So, in terms of price to performance, DDR2 just wasn't that great compared to DDR1. And even if someone really upgraded their RAM, they also had to buy a new motherboard that's compatible with the RAM generation they're using. That's why some people at the time chose not to upgrade and kept using DDR1 instead. DDR3 came out in 2007, and this RAM generation is what made computers more commonly used by normal people. This happens because the voltage of DDR3 got lowered to just 1.5 volts, which is great. So, not only did PCs run even cooler, but laptop batteries could last longer as well. DDR3 also ran at higher speeds from 800 to 600 MHz and had a memory capacity from 4 GB to 8 GB per stick, which made it good for light photo editing, gaming, and heavier multitasking. But the most important thing about DDR3 was that it introduced dual-channel technology. With this feature, doing things feels more instant since 2 RAM sticks move data a lot faster instead of just one. And not only that, this dual channel is also very useful for computers that use integrated graphics. Because unlike a dedicated graphics card that has its own memory called VRRAM, an integrated GPU doesn't have its own memory. So, in order to load images, render game graphics, and things like that, it will use your system's RAM instead. That's why having dual-channel RAM will improve visual smoothness and even give higher FPS when gaming with integrated graphics. But just a side note about dual-channel RAM though, it's always better to use RAM sticks with the same speed and brand. And this doesn't only apply to DDR3, but also DDR4 and DDR5. Because if you mix RAM sticks with different speeds, it will still work, but everything will automatically run at the lowest speed. And even if you try to change the RAM speed manually in the BIOS menu, your system might become unstable or crash later. You can also mix RAM sticks from different brands that have the same speed, but sometimes it can cause random errors or instability because different brands may use different memory chips or electrical circuits. Anyway, the point is, DDR3 with dual channel was already really good, but it wasn't perfect in that era, because even with fast DDR3, computers in 2007 still felt heavy to run, and the reason wasn't the RAM itself. It was because computers used Windows Vista. So, Windows Vista was infamous because it consumed a massive amount of resources like RAM and power. This happened because Vista used a new 3D transparent design called the Aero interface. It looked nice and modern, but it also made computers feel laggy and slow. And not just that, even popular games in that era, such as Crysis, were also insanely heavy as well. So, in the end, DDR3's smooth performance that I explained in the beginning only showed up when Windows 7 came a few years later. DDR4 came out in 2014, and it became the current standard for modern computers. It typically runs at speeds from around 2,400 MHz to 3,600 MHz and supports much larger sizes from 8 to 16 GB per stick. This made DDR4 great for video editing, programming, streaming, playing AAA games, and much more. And since DDR4 was that capable, it stayed around the longest based on its release time. It has become so common that people just keep using them. Also, unlike the previous DDR generations that had some sort of problem in their time, DDR4 can actually coexist well with the operating system in various programs of its era. And talking about programs, today there are RAM standards that we all must know to run those programs. 8 GB of RAM is the minimum for doing everyday tasks like browsing the web and office work. But these days, 8 GB of RAM is not recommended to have, especially since there are some programs like Google Chrome that consume a lot of RAM. So in practice, you can only open maybe like 2 or 3 software at max. That's why 16 GB of RAM is the ideal amount for multitasking. But not just that. 16 GB is also important if you're playing AAA games or doing video editing, and it's usually always written in the system requirement because these kinds of programs are indeed that heavy. As for 32 GB, it's suitable for heavier work like programming or engineering. It's also great if you like playing AAA games while also streaming and chatting at the same time. But just in case you're wondering, does having more RAM always mean better performance? The answer is yes, but only up to a limit. For example, let's say we play a heavy game that requires us to have at least 12 GB of RAM. If we play with just 8 GB of RAM, it's technically possible, but the FPS we get will be lower. And if we play with 12 GB of RAM, it's going to feel smooth since we've met the system requirement. But if we play with 16 GB of RAM, it almost doesn't increase the FPS anymore because the system already has enough memory to work with. DDR5 came out in 2020 as the top-tier RAM for heavy-duty workloads. It runs at much higher speeds starting around 4,800 MHz to 6,000 MHz with larger memory capacities at 8, 6, or 32 GB per stick, which is useful for demanding tasks like 3D rendering, 4K video editing, and of course, high-end gaming. Every high-performance laptop and many gaming PCs use this RAM. The reason is simple, because the performance of DDR5 is just way better compared to DDR4. That if we play demanding games with the same setup, the amount of FPS we get is always better when using DDR5. Another thing that makes DDR5 special is because it has a feature called ECC, or Error Correcting Code, inside its chip. This feature can automatically find and correct small data mistakes in RAM. So in practice, it prevents random data errors during long or heavy workloads. However, with all these features and performance, DDR5 RAM is of course more expensive than any other RAM. And for normal everyday tasks, DDR4 is still more than enough anyway. Especially when this video was made, we were in the era of RAM shortages due to AI datasets' high demand for memory, which is why RAM prices skyrocketed like crazy. Anyway, I also made some other cool videos too, so don't forget to watch them later. Thanks for watching XGen Picks.